In this video, I will give a brief overview of Chinese geography that could come in handy as you read Chinese history. One of the hardest things about learning Chinese history is orienting yourself to the geography, so in this video I will try to demystify some of this, and provide you with a framework for thinking about it. It helps that despite its complexity, the geography has not changed much from the beginning of Chinese history to the present day, and so, once you learn the basic principles, you can apply them across many different time periods. The key geographical feature of China is just how isolated it is from the rest of Asia. In the west is the Tibetan Plateau and the mountains of Central Asia, which even to this day are nearly impassable. To the north are the steppes of Central Asia, the Gobi Desert, and more mountains. To the south are the mountains that form the spine of mainland Southeast Asia, and to the east is the Pacific Ocean. Within the external constraints set by these outer boundaries are even more internal constraints that separate the different regions of China from one another. Northern China is dominated by one large plain, whereas the northwest and south are mostly mountainous with many small river valleys. A large number of ancient civilizations lived in the entirety of this area during Neolithic times, but the open plain in the north meant that over time, it was easy for a few powers to dominate the area, after which they could easily browbeat their smaller neighbors scattered around the many river valleys into submission, until they reached the bigger outer boundaries and had nowhere else left to expand. As much as the formidable outer boundaries facilitated unification and centralization, the smaller internal boundaries also promoted regionalization and fragmentation. Ancient China was just too big to be easily ruled under one government with pre-modern communication and transportation technologies. The mountains and rivers divide the land into many subregions, some with very formidable natural barriers, making it easy for warlords to break off during periods of weak central authority. But then, no matter how politically fragmented the land would become, because of the even bigger outer constraints set by the Tibetan Plateau, Gobi Desert, and Pacific Ocean, it would still only be a matter of time until one faction will grow powerful enough that it could browbeat the other factions into submission, again unifying China. As the famous opening sentence of the novel The Romance of the Three Kingdoms states, "The empire long united must divide, long divided must unite." And to make matters worse, much of the ancient Chinese economy was centered around intensive agriculture to support as large of a population as possible, along with high levels of political centralization that was unmatched in just about anywhere in the world until near modern times, meant that when things fell apart, they really fell apart. 7 of the 10 bloodiest conflicts in history were either conflicts within China or involved foreign invasions of China. Ancient China was not a place you would want to be during chaotic times. So with all this said, let us look more closely at some of the major geographical features that played important roles in Chinese history. In the north is the Yellow River. It flows through the North China Plain, where it is very prone to flooding, especially because it carries so much silt that gives it its characteristic yellow color. Because of the frequent flooding, the course of the lower Yellow River has changed many times throughout recorded Chinese history, and flooding of the Yellow River has caused tremendous loss of life over this time. But nonetheless, the Yellow River was far more stable during earlier periods of Chinese history than more modern periods, when upstream deforestation made the river far more unstable. During the earlier time periods, the North China Plain along the lower Yellow River, and especially the region between the northward bend of the Yellow River and the mountains further to the north, was consistently one of the wealthiest, most densely populated parts of China. Prior to reaching the North China Plain, the Yellow River also flows through the lowest plateau, named after the soft yellow soil that gives the Yellow River its characteristic color. The lowest plateau is bounded by a few formidable mountain ranges, including the Qin Mountains and the Taihang Mountains. Near these mountains are short but important tributaries of the Yellow River, the Wei, Fen, and Luo rivers, around which some of the earliest Chinese dynasties developed. The great ancient Chinese capitals of Chang'an, modern-day Xi'an, and Luoyang were located in these valleys. A recurring theme for much of Chinese history has been the relationship between the valleys in the west and the plains to the east. As a general rule of thumb, the big, flat eastern area was wealthier and more culturally influential than the west, whereas the west had oversized political and military influence over the east due to its advantageous mountain geography and proximity to the northwestern frontiers. During times of peace, the political interests of the more populated East could be a thorn on the side of the emperor based out of the less populated West, but during times of chaos, the East, with far fewer natural defenses, was often hit very hard, whereas the mountain valleys of the West were often well protected, serving as secure bases for ambitious warlords to conquer the rest of China. In the south is the Yangtze River, the longest river in China and the third longest in the world. For almost its entire length, the Yangtze River flows through fairly mountainous terrains, making the south much more geographically fragmented than the north. In ancient times, there were also large expanses of marshes along the Yangtze, making the plains immediately along the Yangtze River much less densely populated than those along the Yellow River. The Yangtze River has unique geographical advantages that facilitated the growth of a large, centralized empire. It is highly navigable, even taking into account the borderline treacherous waters through the Three Gorges. It also rarely flooded, at least before heavy deforestation took place in recent centuries. Its many tributaries expanded the Yangtze River network even more. In the mountainous southwest, the Min, Tuo, and Jialing rivers have long served as major transportation routes within this isolated region. In the center and flowing from the north is the Han River, the longest tributary of the Yangtze. The Han River flows into the Yangtze at the modern-day city of Wuhan, and where the Han in the city's name came from. In ancient times, the unique bend of the Han River and its tributaries allow for almost continuous water transportation from the Yellow River to the Yangtze. Flowing into the Yangtze from the south are the Xiang and Gan rivers. These two rivers originate in the mountains in far southern China and have served as the main routes for the ancient Chinese dynasty's expansion into the deep south. Additional tributaries also lead from the Yangtze into the mountains of the far southwest, which to this day are still some of the most remote regions in China. The mountains along the Yangtze divide its course into three regions: a downstream region centered around the Yangtze River Delta and especially the city of Nanjing, a midstream region centered around the Han and Xiang rivers, and an upstream region in the southwestern mountains. Much of southern Chinese history involved the balance of power between these three regions. As you may have noticed by now, it was much easier to travel east-west along the axis of both the Yellow and Yangtze rivers than to travel north-south between their watersheds, and this gives way to the biggest Chinese geographical divide of them all, the divide between north and south. This was the most common divide during times of division. The main boundary between north and south lies in a line formed by the Qin Mountains and the Huai River. North of this line, the climate is much colder and drier. It snows in the winter, and wheat is currently the main staple grain. South of this line, the climate is much warmer and wetter. It rarely snows in the winter, and rice has traditionally been the main staple grain. The Huai River has been the third most important river in Chinese history. In ancient times, it flowed directly eastward into the sea, but since the 12th century, because of constant southward flooding of the Yellow River, the Huai was forced to flow southward so that it is now a tributary of the Yangtze. The Huai has a number of historically important tributaries from the north, the most important of which are the Si River, which no longer follows its ancient course because of the Yellow River messing things up, the Ying, and the Ru. During centuries of unification, the Huai River and its tributaries serve as major trade routes, and during centuries of division, it often marked the frontier between north and south. The flat, densely populated plain between the Huai and Yellow rivers is known as the Central Plains, or in Chinese, Zhongyuan. Technically, Zhongyuan has many different meanings in many different contexts, but for the purpose of this video, we will use the most common geographical definition, which is the flat central area between the Yellow and Huai rivers that link the peripheral mountainous regions to one another. Because it was located at the intersection of so many different regions with no natural defenses, during times of war, it was a central arena where the warlords duked it out for control of China. Strategically, the most important city in Zhongyuan has long been Xuzhou, making it one of the most sought-after cities in China. Although if you were to be a Chinese warlord, Zhongyuan would have been one of the last places on the map you will want to start out on, since you would be immediately surrounded by enemies with nowhere to hide. Cao Cao, the famous warlord in the novel The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, was the only warlord to ever start out in the Central Plains and from there successfully conquer the rest of northern China. And even he ran out of steam afterwards trying to conquer the south. In ancient times, traveling to the south from Zhongyuan was difficult because of the large north-south distances involved. One popular route was to take advantage of the northward bend of the Han River and its tributaries, and for this reason the city of Xiangyang, located on the Han River, was one of the most strategically important cities in Chinese history. There are no major, natural, north-south waterways on the coastal plains, so an artificial one, the Grand Canal, was built. Kaifeng, the fabulously wealthy capital of the Northern Song dynasty from the 10th to 12th centuries, developed as a transportation hub along the canal. A third route between north and south was from the Wei River Valley, through various mountain passes in the Qin Mountains to the Han River, and from there through the Daba Mountains to the basin around modern-day Chengdu. This route was notoriously steep and difficult, and in ancient times many segments, especially through the Qin Mountains, were made up of wooden planks attached to the side of the mountains, like these. The city of Hanzhong, or literally middle of the Han, has long been the primary city along this route and served as a strategically vital link between the northwest and the southwest. Now, let's move on to the northern frontier. In the north, separating the rest of China from the steppes are a long line of mountains, the Yin or Shadow Mountains to the west, and the Yan Mountains to the east. Not only do these two mountains form an easily defensible frontier against the nomadic tribes further north, but they also roughly mark the 400mm rainfall line, north of which rainfall is so sparse that settled agriculture could not be supported, and the way of life centered around pastoralism. The earlier iterations of the Great Wall were built on top of these mountains. South of the Great Wall, the economy was based almost all on settled agriculture, which the Chinese dynasty could control relatively easily. North of the Great Wall, the economy was based almost all on pastoralism, which made it hard for most Chinese dynasties to control. The most important city along the Great Wall is Beijing, which protected the narrow gap between the Taihang Mountains and the sea. If Beijing were to fall, then the nomads could ride to the north bank of the Yellow River within weeks to devastate one of the core regions of the empire. During the winter, when the waters of the Yellow River usually froze, they could in theory ride even further south. To the southwest of Beijing is Taiyuan, located in the dead center of the highlands of modern-day Shanxi province, from which it controlled the high ground overlooking the surrounding regions. Beijing and Taiyuan work as a pair to defend the rest of China against nomadic invasions. As recently as the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, the Japanese captured Beijing, then known as Beiping, quite easily, but before they could march further south, they had to first fight through the mountains of Shanxi province to capture Taiyuan in order to secure their flank. Further to the west, a thin, long strip of decently low-lying, arable land sits between the Qilian Mountains, which mark the northern edge of the Tibetan Plateau, and the Mongolian steppes. This is known as the Hexi Corridor, or West River Corridor, since it is located west of the bend of the Yellow River, and was a key bottleneck along the Silk Road linking China with the rest of Asia. Now moving to the deep south, there are a series of east-west mountains, with the most prominent peaks known as the Nanling, in English the Southern Mountains, or Wuling, in English the Five Mountains. To the people in the early Chinese dynasties living in the north, the Wuling might as well as have been the edge of the world. The lands south of the Wuling were collectively known as Lingnan, or south of the mountains, inhabited by countless barbarian tribes whose customs they knew little about. The Wuling separated the watershed of the Yangtze River from that of the Pearl River. After the region was first conquered by the Qin dynasty around 200 BC, a canal known as the Lingqu was dug connecting the Xiang River to a tributary of the Pearl River known as the Li River, where the famous landscapes of Guilin are located. This became the major route from the rest of China to Lingnan, and by extension, Guangzhou, which soon grew to become the major city in Lingnan. Over the ensuing centuries, more mountain roads were carved through the mountains, although these mountainous regions remain very remote to the present day. The eastern parts of Lingnan in modern-day Guangdong province eventually became heavily Sinicized, whereas the western parts of Lingnan, the modern-day Guangxi Autonomous Region, has large populations of non-Han Chinese minorities. Northern Vietnam was also part of Lingnan and under Chinese rule for 1100 years to 900 AD. In ancient times, the Red River Valley in northern Vietnam was one of the wealthiest, most populated regions of Lingnan and separated from the lands further north by many remote mountain ranges. There were many reasons why Vietnam was able to eventually gain its independence from China, but one very obvious reason was simply that northern Vietnam was significantly wealthier and more populated than the regions immediately to its north, which even to this day lag behind the more economically developed parts of China. When rebellions took place in Vietnam, ancient Chinese armies had to travel tremendous distances through sparsely populated lands just to get there. In the very early days of Imperial Chinese history around 200 BC, the north, centered along the Yellow River, was the political, cultural, military, and economic center of China. The rest of Chinese history, however, has essentially been a continuous process of the north becoming poorer and poorer and the south becoming richer and richer. This was largely because the north has been periodically shattered by cataclysmic wars, each time resulting in large-scale migrations to the south, whereas the south has generally enjoyed much more stable growth. The repeated flooding of the Yellow River has also severely damaged the economy of the North China Plain. This pattern is a major factor why so much of earlier Chinese history, such as the events in the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, involve northern China, but more modern Chinese history overwhelmingly involves the Yangtze and the far south. Nowadays, southern China as a whole is much more economically developed than the north, although the north still holds oversized political and military importance. Part of this is historical. In traditional Chinese consciousness, there has long been a strong sense that only when a regime has controlled the north, especially Zhongyuan, could it really claim authority over all of China. And part of this is simply geographical. The northern frontier needs to be defended, and the open terrain of the north still creates one huge economic, cultural, and transportation hub that serves as a connecting piece for the rest of China. For northern China, the core regions were initially around the Yellow River and the Central Plains oriented in an east-west axis. A recurring theme for the first two-thirds of Chinese history involved the tensions between east and west along this axis. But as time went on, more and more of the population and wealth shifted towards the southeast. After 1000 AD, the northwest around Xi'an, which had previously been the capital of so many Chinese dynasties, has been mostly a backwater living off of its former glory. As the northwest declined and the south became more important, the east-west axis that had previously dominated Chinese politics was replaced by a north-south axis, with the north centered around Beijing. Especially since the ruling elites of the Mongol Yuan dynasty and the Manchu Qing dynasty relied on Beijing's northerly location to maintain their ties with their original power bases. Goods from all across southern China were shipped down the Yangtze River and then up the Grand Canal to Beijing. The closer we are to the modern day, the more important this north-south axis would become. This corridor is still relevant today, with the political center of China located in Beijing, but its economic heart in Shanghai. That is it for now. I hope this video can give you a brief overview of historical Chinese geography and help you orient yourself as you learn more. And in the future, I plan to create many more videos on historical Chinese geography to discuss these geographical features and strategic cities in much more detail.